Hey guys, welcome back to another Super Unreal Power tutorial. Today, we're sort of going to continue the fireball tutorial that we did a few years back. I noticed in the comments to that video that many of you were asking about how to deal damage with a fireball. I was in the middle of typing out a comment and realized that the topic of damage is a bit complex for a comment reply. So I decided to make a video on it instead. Now here we'll show you how it works. Okay, so we can shoot our ice ball this time. We switched to ice instead of fire this time just because I wanted to mix it up a little bit. Alright, now that we know the projectile will go, we'll shoot one of these enemies here. Alright, and then that takes him out. Oh, missed there. Alright, there we go. And that's about how it works. Now we'll dive into the damage system. Now, dealing damage will require that we have a few working animations, which takes a lot of time to set up. So I'm going to start with a character that I set up beforehand. If you feel a little lost, go ahead and watch my fireball or flying tutorial to see how to set up animation blueprints and then come back. If you're wanting to follow along exactly, I did use a couple asset packs that I purchased, one of them being this FX Variety pack here, which is what I used to get that ice ball effect. For the animations, I used this Flying Mage set from We Make the Game. I've used a lot of their animation packs before, and this one in particular actually has, even though it's a Flying Mage, it actually has a set of ground animations, and that's what we'll be using for this pack. But feel free to use any other animations or special effects packs that you have instead. Alright, now before we get started, I need to show you some adjustments that I made. So let's go to the project settings and I'll show you what we did here. So over in input, I actually added a new action mapping for fire, pretty simple to set up, and then I just set it to function with the gamepad trigger, the F key, and then the mouse button. Second, this damage system is based off of collision spheres and such, so we need to create a couple collision channels just to get this to work right. So if you click collision, which is just a little bit above inputs, you'll see that in object channels I actually added projectile and enemy. And both of those are there because, well, first we want the projectile to affect our targets, but not ourselves. And we also want to be very particular about what these projectiles affect because we really only want to cause damage to things like enemy characters and whatnot. And we'll go ahead and close that out. And then we'll start with some basic blueprints that we'll need. First off, let's go down to the third person blueprint folder here. And we're going to need to find the third person character. We're going to duplicate this character, and let's just call this BP underscore test character. And then we are going to slide this back into our damage test folder. Now that we have our character in the proper folder, we are going to right click and duplicate this character and just call this BP underscore, we'll do test enemy. Alright, next we're going to need to create the projectile that we're going to use. So what we're going to do is we're going to go right click, blueprint class, and we're going to create a new actor. And let's just call this BP underscore test projectile. And if this is a brand new project, then you're also going to need a new game mode base so we can edit the default pawn class. To get that, just right click, blueprint class, and add a game mode base. And then I just called mine GM base. And then we'll switch the game mode override to that game mode, and then we will change our default pawn class. Actually, this is on the test character, the other character. We're going to change this to our test character here. And now we should be just about all set to go. So first let's start with a projectile. So we'll open that one up. And we're going to need to add a few components here. First, let's add a collision sphere. And this is what's going to be used to measure if we are hitting a target and need to deal damage or not. So let's just leave that as sphere. Go ahead and add this to the default scene root. Or add this as the default scene root. And we're going to make sure that the radius is 32. And then we're going to scroll down to collision. We're going to set these collision presets to custom. We'll change this from world dynamic to projectile. And let's set everything to block, and then we will set a few of these to ignore, starting with visibility, camera, pawn, and projectile. And that's all we need for the sphere collision. Next we're going to add a static mesh. And this static mesh, we're just going to call this projectile mesh. And let's edit the collision for this guy too. First, we'll set it to custom. Now it starts off with setting everything to block because of our last custom setting. So next we're going to set this to projectile, and then we want to make sure that this projectile ignores visibility, camera, physics body this time, and projectile. And then the last component that we are going to need is projectile movement, and this is what's going to make our projectile, well, shoot forward. And we have a few things to change in here real quick. First, we need to set the initial speed to, we'll go with 2000. We'll set the max speed to 2000. We need to make sure that initial velocity in local space is checked. And then we also need to make sure that our gravity is set to 0 so the projectile just goes straight instead of dropping. And then last, we need to go down to velocity and make sure that just X is set to 1 and Y and Z are 0. We need one more thing for our projectile mesh. We need to actually add the mesh. So over in static mesh, we're just going to type in material sphere, which is this guy. And let's set the scale of this to 0.3 on everything, on X, Y, and Z. Should be a good size. We want the collision sphere to overlap or to extend beyond the static mesh. So now we can compile and go into the event graph. We don't need to do anything with the begin plays or event ticks, so we're just going to scroll down here and we're going to add in an event hit node. The nice thing about this damage system is that everything is self-contained within the event hit function and that function that we will use within our enemy character, which is on any damage. So it's kind of an easy way to do damage. Alright, so the first thing that we're going to do is when this projectile hits something, we want it to send out some sparks or something like that. So what we'll do is we are going to emitter, we'll spawn emitter at location, and we're just going to set this emitter, I think I had it set for the ice ball to a water ball hit here. And the location that this is going to spawn at is going to be our hit location. And next we're going to drag off of our hit and we are going to break hit result. And we need some information from this, namely the hit actor. And we are going to drag off and add a apply damage. We will plug this in after the emitter. The base damage, this is going to be how much damage we're going to deal to the target. So we're just going to promote this to a variable and we'll leave it as base damage. But let's compile and give it a default value of 1. Okay, now after the projectile deals damage, we want to make sure that it destroys itself so we don't have stacking up of assets causing the game to run terrible. So we're going to get a destroy actor node. Now one thing that I've kind of started to do with projectiles a little bit is actually add a very slight delay in, and we're going to set this delay to 0.01, excuse me. And what this does is it makes sure that this actor doesn't destroy itself until everything else is completed. So what will happen is on event hit, it's going to spawn this emitter, it's going to apply the damage, and after it applies the damage, it's going to wait just a split second and then destroy itself. And that way it makes sure that everything else processes before it's gone. And that's all we need to do for the projectile, so let's save and close. And the next thing that we're going to add is our character's ability to shoot the projectile. Alright, now before we get started on that ability though, we need to adjust the collision on the character as well. Let's open up our capsule collision here, and then we are going to go to the collision presets. Let's change this from pawn to custom, and we are going to set collision enabled back to collision enabled. When I set it to no collision, it changed the collision enabled to disabled the collision, so we need to reset that back. And it automatically set everything besides visibility and camera to block. And we are going to set projectile to ignore, and then we are going to change the object type here to pawn, and we're going to make sure that this also, well no, actually we don't want it to be able to go through other pawns, so we're going to leave that as it is. And that's that for the sphere or the capsule collision. We'll compile and we'll save. And we need to edit the mesh as well just a bit. Go into the collision presets. We're going to set this to custom. We'll go ahead and leave this as pawn. Okay. And then we just need to make sure that pawn and vehicle are checked, so we're good to go there. Now there's one other component that we need to add, and that's going to be a sphere collision. And the reason we're going to do that is because instead of spawning this projectile from a bone socket, this time we're just going to create a little collision sphere that'll just appear right here. It'll be invisible, of course, and then we are going to spawn projectiles from that instead, just to keep it simple. So we'll add component, sphere collision, and we're just going to call this projectile spawn. Compile, save, we'll go into the event graph. And we actually need to change something on the projectile spawn real quick. We need to set the collision presets to no collision. And we need to change the radius real quick from 32 to 6. Just to keep it a lot smaller, and then we are also going to need to move it out just a bit. Just following the animation, just because I know where it's at, I'm going to put it just right about the neckline, because he's going to reach his hand out and then shoot it, kind of like Iron Man or something. So about there will work. If you know what animation you're going to use for your montage, you can also readjust this for wherever you want the projectiles to spawn from. So now we'll go into the event graph. We are going to add in the input action for firing. And the first thing that we're going to add is a play and a montage. And then this montage here, we are getting that from our animations. We'll just pause right here for our character, and then we're going to go back out. Now, like I said, we used the Flight Mage animation pack here. And there's a few differences that I did in the animation blueprint and the montage, and I'll just show you that right now. So I believe it's in place. In this animation pack, I'm just taking all of the ground-based animations here because we aren't going to be flying for this tutorial. And now we need to retarget these to the correct skeleton. When these come in, obviously this is a different looking skeleton than the one that I'm using. So in order to make these compatible, we need to go into the skeleton of both these animations and then the skeleton that our character is using. And we need to make sure that the rig is set to humanoid. And then we auto map all these. And then we should be good to go. So now back to our animations. We'll select all the ones that we want to retarget, and we would retarget animation assets, duplicate, and then select the skeleton that we'd want. Now I already did this, and I have actually put a folder inside the damage test that contains all of these retarget animation assets, but I just wanted to show you what we were using. Now we also have some montages here. So what we're using to fire is this attack 2. So what we need to do is we need to right click and we need to create an anim montage here. And we're just going to call this am underscore attack test. And then we'll open this up. Now what we're going to do is when we're using montages, the purpose of using a montage is so you can attack, or one of the purposes is so that you can attack while you're moving and blend between your standard locomotion you're walking around and your attacks or other actions. So what we need to do, or what I did, was over in Slot Manager, I added a new slot that I just called Upper Body because I just want this character to do this animation from the just from the upper body. And then we go into this default slot here, and then we go to slot name and select that upper body slot. And now, as you can see, it changed. It put the character into that Unreal pose. To get this guy actually performing the animation again, we'll just click on Apply to Asset over here on the right. And then we are all good to go. So we will save, close that. And now I'll show you how I did the animation blueprint. So here we have our blend space. And to create a blend space, if you haven't done so already, right click in the window and then we will go to animation and then select a new blend space here. Now with my blend space, what we did here is super simple. We just have a standard idle animation here, and then walk forward, back, left, and right. And these motions are based off of horizontal and vertical axes for speed and direction, a horizontal being direction and vertical being speed. And then we also want to set those with a minimum value of -100 and a maximum of 100 for both. And this way, it's treating this like a quadrant, like what you've probably learned in algebra, with the idle point being at 0 and 0, 0 speed and 0 direction. And if we go into the negative direction, then we will start going left. And if we go into the positive horizontal direction, we will start going right. Positive on the speed, we'll run forward. Negative on the speed, and we'll run back. So that's how the blend space works. So we can go ahead and save and close that out. And then here is our animation blueprint. Now, as you can see, there's quite a bit of changes here. So what we did here is we are going to be, like I said, we're going to be blending between the locomotion and then the upper body animations, animation montages. So what we do is we take our locomotion, then we create a saved cache, and we'll get a couple references to that, and we get this layered blend per bone. We'll plug one cache in as the base pose, and then we will plug the next one into a default group slot, and then we change the slot to upper body instead of default and plug that in for the base pose 0. Now where this is blending is with the bone name here. Now we want to blend at about the waist, and on the mannequin that is spine_02. From spine 02 down, we will be doing the locomotion, but from spine 02 up, if active, we'll do those animation montages that will function just from the waist up. And that way we can shoot the projectile while we're still walking. Because if you remember on that montage, the character is shooting while standing still. So this lets us be a little more nimble. Right, now in our locomotion, now a big change that I did here was I have a state just for the idle, and then we have another state which has that blend space here. And also note that we promoted the direction and speed to variables here in the blueprint. And then we have a couple transitions which are based off of speed. So we plug the speed in, and if our speed becomes greater than 10, then we will enter the transition and go into our jogging blend space. And if our speed drops to 10 or below, then we will transition back to our idle. And then the jumps are the exact same as the jump animation for the Unreal character that you start with, which is possible because we converted all the animations for this blueprint to use the same mannequin. With that out of the way, we'll close out of the animation blueprint, and we can now select that new montage that we created, which was, I believe, attack test. And then we are going to want to spawn our projectile, so we'll type in spawn actor from class. And instead of plugging this directly in, we want to add a delay node in between. And the reason is that if you don't have this delay and it just plugs directly in here, how the queue will work is when you hit the fire button, you'll start that animation montage, and as soon as that animation is started, then it will fire the projectile. But we kind of want that projectile to spawn at a certain point in the animation. So we'll plug these in, and I'll show you how we get that time. So we'll go back, we'll find our montage, and let's pause it real quick. So we want this projectile to spawn right about here, which is about 0.65 seconds. We'll set it to that. That's a nice round number. So we'll close that out, go back to our character, and we're going to set the duration to 0.65. And this way it's going to wait to spawn the projectile until right at the moment where we want it to. So we need to pick our class here, and we are just going to get that test projectile and set that as the actor that we're spawning. And now we want to set the collision handling override to always spawn ignore collisions. And next we need to get that projectile spawn and tell the blueprint where to spawn it. So we'll grab our projectile. Let's get actor actually it's world transform. Let's see, get world transform. We'll plug this in directly here. And then we are going to extend this, and we want to add an int the owner here, which is going to be a reference to self. And that is all we need to do for launching the projectile. So let's compile, we will save, we'll close out of our character because we don't need him anymore. Back to our damage test, and we're finally going to define how the enemy will take damage. So let's make a few changes here. First, we don't need any of the action inputs because this character is, well, it's just going to stand there for us, but otherwise it would run off of an AI. So we'll get rid of the camera boom and the follow cam as well. Delete those, compile, and now we're going to need to add some new variables. First, we need some health, because if we don't have health, then we can't deal damage to the enemy, and then everything's for naught. So we'll add a new variable. We'll just call this current health. Let's change this to a float, and then let's compile so we can change the default value, and let's just set this to 2. Just keep it simple. And we also want our character to die after their health reaches 0. So let's add another variable, and we're just going to call this isDead, and then we need this to be a boolean. And we'll get into where we use this here in a second. Now before we define the damage function, we are going to edit the collision of the character. So let's start with the capsule collision. And we need to change the collision preset from pawn to custom. Make sure that collision is enabled again. Let's change the object type from pawn to enemy channel. Now everything besides visibility will be set to block. And we want to ignore the physics body and the projectile. So we want the projectile to pass through the collision sphere and hit the character. And that's everything for the capsule. Now we need to alter the mesh collision. So scroll down. Once again, change this from character mesh to custom. Set the object type to enemy channel. And we want to make sure that we are ignoring visibility, pawn, and enemy channel. Vehicles we're not really using, so we'll just leave that as it is. And the rest should be block. And this way, the projectile is going to go through our collision capsule, but it's not going to pass through the static mesh for the character itself, which is exactly what we want to do. So now we will compile. Let's double check that our collisions are all set to enabled actually real quick. Collision enabled. We want the collision, good thing we came back. We need to set that to collision enabled. Now we'll compile, save, and now we will go into the event graph and define how we take damage. So we're going to start with an event any damage node. So we need to grab our current health, and we need to set our current health to be our, well, what our previous current health is, minus the damage that we take. So we'll get our current health this time. We're going to select a float minus float. We're going to add the damage to the bottom pin of the minus node, and we'll plug this in as our current health. Now, anytime we take damage, it's going to update our current health. The next thing that we want to do is set up the death functionality for the character. So we're going to add a branch here, plug in the executable, and the condition this time is going to be checking if our current health is less than or equal to 0. Slide off, get the less than or equal to float. And the reason why we want to do less than or equal to instead of just equal to 0 is because if the character takes damage and they take more damage than what they have the capabilities of taking, let's say they take, they're in the negative value for health, then it will actually not trigger the character to die. So what we need to do is make sure that anything 0 and lower will set the character to dead. Now, if our health is 0 or below off of the true, we want to get is dead, and we are going to set that value to true. If the character is not dead, we are not going to do anything, but just so we can tell that we're actually hitting the character, we're going to put in a print string, and we'll just type in ouch. So now if we hit the character and they're not dead yet, they're going to say ouch. So we'll compile, and then we'll save. Now before we can test, we need to make sure that the character can actually die, because when you start a new project, the mannequin doesn't actually have a death animation set up. So what we need to do is go to our mesh. We're going to grab our animation blueprint here. open this guy up. We need to, from try get pawn owner, we're going to drag off and we are going to cast to our enemy character, which I believe was test enemy. And then we will connect the pin here. And then we are going to get our is dead. Now, as you can see, I already have a variable here for is dead, and the reason why is because in our animation graph, I created a state called is dead. In this state, I have the death animation that we have, and just one little heads up, when for the death animation that you slide in, you also want to make sure that loop animation is not checked, because you don't want to loop through the death animation over and over and over again. It just isn't what we want. It doesn't look good. So we'll go back. And then for the transition rules, we created a local variable called isDead. If the animation blueprint recognizes that the character is dead, then it'll transition to the death animation. And then if it's not, of course, then we go back. All right, now in our event graph, what we can do here is get the local isDead and connect that to the isDead from our enemy character. And now, anytime this character's health reaches 0, it'll go into that death animation. We'll close that out, and here we should be all set to test. So we'll hit play, and here's our character, and he's not doing the animations because we missed one little thing. We're going to go back into our character, and we need to actually make sure that we're using the right animation blueprint. So we'll go into our mesh, we'll look at the animation class here, and we need to find, I'm going to use animation blueprint Iceman, which was the one that I created for the character previously. So now that that's set, we'll save. All right. So the other thing we need to do is we need to get rid of the old test enemies. And then we need to add in our new test enemy. Flip this guy around, and then we'll play. Okay. And now we will, so now as you can see, we can move around. Our animation blueprint works. We'll shoot. And the projectile is firing just like we want it. And now we will try and take out our target here. So we'll shoot him. Oh, looks like we hit him once, and we'll hit him again, and he dies. Looks like everything's working just right. Thanks for watching, guys. I hope you enjoyed learning how to do basic damage. If you got something out of this video, give it a like. Also, I'm thinking of spending the next several videos on ways to deal damage and damage types, such as dealing radial damage or elemental damage, or maybe even a line trace. So let me know in the comments below if that sounds interesting to you, or what types of damage would be most helpful to you guys. Thanks, and we'll see you next time on Super Unreal Powers.